James Hartley, a powerful billionaire, thought he had moved on from his ex-wife, Elena. But at a lavish charity gala, her unexpected return with a shocking letter shatters his world. "This is your son." This revelation throws James into an emotional whirlwind, forcing him to confront his past and question everything he believed. The soft amber light from the grand crystal chandelier cascaded over the expansive living room, where every detail exuded opulence. Luxurious leather sofas, a stately oak fireplace, and exquisite art adorning the walls spoke of the absolute wealth of the home's owner. Yet, despite its brilliance, the room carried an oppressive chill, a suffocating emptiness that lingered in the air. Elena sat quietly on the cream-colored sofa, her hands clasped tightly together. The pale blue silk dress she wore clung to her slender frame, but couldn't conceal the subtle tremor in her shoulders. Her eyes, rimmed red, stared vacantly out through the large glass window, where the city's glittering lights painted the night. James entered the room with an air of practiced composure, his tailored black suit accentuating the cool detachment in his demeanor. He regarded Elena for a long moment, his piercing gaze sharp and scrutinizing. "So," he began, his voice deep and steady, though tinged with impatience, "what is it you wanted to talk about?" Elena swallowed hard. She had rehearsed this conversation countless nights, yet now, the words seemed caught in her throat. Her hands tightened, as if bracing herself against her own collapse. "James, I can't do this anymore," she finally said, her voice soft but resolute. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, but it disappeared almost instantly. "What do you mean?" he asked, sitting across from her, his gaze fixed intently on her face. Elena looked up, her eyes shimmering with tears. "We're not the same anymore. I feel like I'm trapped in a gilded cage. A place without love, just emptiness." James's brow furrowed slightly. "What are you talking about? You have everything. A home most people can only dream of, every luxury, and the freedom to do whatever you want." "But I don't have you, James," Elena interrupted, her voice breaking. "I don't need all of this. I need you. A husband who's present, not someone who puts work and ambition above his family." James leaned back, crossing his arms. He looked like a man enduring a trivial complaint. "You think all of this just appeared out of nowhere? Everything you have is the result of my hard work and relentless effort. And in return, I lost you," Elena said, her voice trembling. "Every time I sat waiting for you to come home from meetings, from trips, I wondered, does he even remember me? But day after day, I realized you don't. I'm just a tiny part of your world. That's how you see it?" James asked, a faint, dismissive smirk tugging at his lips. "You don't understand that everything I've done has been for you, for us?" Elena shook her head, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "You say it's for me, but you've never asked me what I wanted. James, I've tried so hard to hold on to this marriage, but I can't do it alone anymore." James remained silent, his eyes growing colder. "So, this is why you call me down here? To blame me?" "It's not blame," Elena whispered, her voice fragile yet unyielding. "It's goodbye. I have to leave." Her words hung in the air like the toll of a bell marking an ending. The silence that followed was so absolute that the ticking of the wall clock became deafening. James stood abruptly, his fists clenched at his sides. He walked to the window, gazing out at the city's shimmering skyline. After a long pause, he turned back to face her. "If that's what you want, then go." Elena's eyes widened, disbelief washing over her. "That's it, James? After everything we've been through, you've already made up your mind, haven't you?" He replied coldly. "I won't keep someone who doesn't want to stay." His words cut through her like a blade. She lowered her head, tears soaking the hem of her dress. After a moment, she rose to her feet, summoning what little strength she had left to steady her voice. "Thank you for everything, James. I hope you find happiness." Turning away, she walked toward the door, leaving James standing alone in the cold, empty room. He didn't turn to watch her go, but as he stared out at the city lights, they seemed dimmer than ever before. Elena rose to her feet, her hands trembling as she pulled a stack of papers from her bag. The rustling sound cut through the oppressive silence of the room, a harsh reminder of the gravity of what was about to unfold. She placed the papers on the table in front of James, her eyes locking onto his with a determination she hadn't realized she possessed. "These are divorce papers," she said, her voice hoarse from the weight of suppressed pain. James froze momentarily, his expression unreadable. He glanced down at the papers, his eyes scanning the text with a detached coldness. "So, you've prepared everything," he said, a faint trace of mockery in his tone. "No need to consult me first?" Elena bit her lip. "If I asked, would you have cared?" "James, I've lived too long in the silence between us. I'm exhausted from facing everything alone while you stand on the sidelines, indifferent." James leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze cutting through the air between them. "I've never been indifferent. Do you think everything you have now came out of thin air? The house, the unlimited resources, the life others only dream of. It all came from me." Elena let out a bitter laugh, her voice laced with equal parts anguish and frustration. "Yes, I have everything, except you." She took a step closer, her tearful eyes boring into his. "Do you know what it's like to eat dinner alone in this enormous kitchen for years? To stay up late every time you traveled, hoping for just one message, one call, only for it to never come? James, all you've ever done is bury yourself in work, leaving me alone in a void you don't even notice." "You're overreacting," James interrupted, a flash of irritation breaking through his composed exterior. "No one forced you to stay. If you're unhappy, that's on you, not me, not your fault." Elena's voice cracked as she nearly shouted, her pain spilling over. "James, I tried over and over again. I tried to love you, to understand you, but you gave me nothing in return. You're so busy proving to the world that you're a successful billionaire, a powerful man, that you never once tried to be a husband." James shot to his feet, his frustration boiling over. "What do you want from me, Elena? Do you want me to give up everything and sit by your side all day? I work for us, to ensure you never want for anything. You're the selfish one here." "Selfish?" Elena whispered, shaking her head as tears streamed down her face. "If asking for a little of your time, your care, your love makes me selfish, then yes, I am selfish. But at least I'm still human. And you?" Her voice broke, unable to finish the thought. The air between them grew stifling, heavy with the weight of emotions they had both buried for far too long. James's gaze wavered briefly, but his tone remained icy. "Elena, if you can't handle this life, then leave. I won't stop you." The finality of his words struck Elena like a dagger. Her knees wobbled, and she collapsed back into her seat, tears flowing freely. For a moment, the world seemed to crumble around her, the years of neglect and heartache washing over her all at once. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I hoped you'd change, that you'd see what I needed. But you only ever cared about your image, your work. We once dreamed of a life together, a family, simple things. But now, you've turned our life into a hollow shell I can't survive in anymore." James stood silently, his rigid posture betraying the storm churning inside him. For a fleeting moment, the hardness in his eyes softened as he looked at her tear-streaked face. A pang of something, regret, guilt, sorrow, tugged at him, but he refused to let it surface. His pride wouldn't allow it. At last, he bent down, picked up the pen, and signed the divorce papers. The scratch of the pen against the paper was deafening, marking the end of everything they had once shared. He placed the pen down and, without looking at her, said, "If this is what you want, then I'll respect your decision." Elena lifted her head, her red-rimmed eyes meeting his. "Thank you, James," she said softly, her voice tinged with both sorrow and resolve. James turned away, staring out the large window at the glittering cityscape below. His back was straight, his head held high, as if to convey he had no regrets. Yet, the lights of the city seemed dimmer, less vibrant than before. Elena picked up the papers and stood. Her steps were heavy, but she knew in her heart that this was the right choice. The large door closed behind her with a soft thud, leaving James alone in the vast, cold room. A single tear escaped down his cheek, but he wiped it away quickly, as though refusing to acknowledge it had ever existed. The heavy door opened and closed behind Elena, the sound echoing through the stillness like a final farewell. She stood on the grand stone steps of the mansion, where the golden glow of the lights spilled onto the long driveway ahead. But the path was obscured by the downpour, rain cascading relentlessly from the pitch-black sky. The small suitcase in her hand seemed meaningless. It couldn't possibly hold the weight of the heartbreak, shattered dreams, and lingering love she still felt for James. She dragged it behind her, each step heavier than the last, as if the rain-soaked ground sought to swallow her whole. The rain fell, as though trying to erase every trace of her presence, but Elena couldn't stop herself from glancing back one final time. Her gaze rested on the imposing mansion that had once been a haven she dreamed of building into a true home. Now, it loomed like an impenetrable fortress, cold, unyielding, and utterly alien. She didn't stop. She knew if she turned back any further, her resolve would falter. Lowering her head, she walked through the grand iron gates. The sound of her suitcase wheels rolling over the slick pavement mixed with the patter of rain, forming a mournful symphony she would never forget. James stood silently by the massive living room window, a glass of untouched red wine in his hand. He watched Elena's figure fade into the rain, becoming nothing more than a speck swallowed by the storm. His chest felt unbearably heavy. His heart, long locked behind walls of logic and control, now seemed to rebel, pounding painfully against the barriers he had built. James clenched his hand tighter around the glass, his usual cold gaze clouded with something unnameable. "She'll be fine," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. But another voice echoed in his mind. "Will she be fine? Or is it you who won't be?" For a brief moment, James was forced to confront a truth he'd been unwilling to face. Elena wasn't just his wife. She was the warmth, the light, the soul of this house. Without her, it was nothing but an empty shell, and he had failed to see it. Now, that light was slipping away, extinguished by his own neglect. Elena walked on, the rain streaming down her pale face. She wasn't crying anymore. There were no tears left. The storm seemed to have stolen them all. But inside, the pain remained, smoldering like embers that refused to die out. Every step felt like a betrayal. She had thought leaving would bring her freedom, but why did it hurt so much? The rain battered her shoulders, a cold reminder of how much she had lost to make this decision. A taxi pulled up by the curb, its headlights cutting through the dark. Elena lowered her head and climbed in, her movements slow and deliberate. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes reflecting concern. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, his voice warm and grounding. Elena nodded faintly, managing a weak smile. "I'm fine. Just take me away from here." The car rolled forward, carrying her into the night. The shadows and rain seemed to envelop everything, but within her mind, one image still burned brightly. James in the early days of their love, when he wasn't the cold, distant man consumed by ambition. James remained at the window, staring into the storm. His hand slackened, and the wine glass slipped from his grasp. It shattered against the plush carpet, shards glinting like frozen tears. He didn't move, didn't bend to pick up the pieces. His mind was consumed by Elena's parting words. "You've lost me." James clenched his fists, his breathing heavy. He had never failed in life. Everything he wanted, he achieved, no matter the cost. But now, he had lost the one thing he couldn't replace. The woman who had meant everything, even if he'd been too blind to realize it. He pressed a hand to his temple, rubbing hard as if to banish the ache spreading through his head. But he knew this wasn't a pain that would fade easily. It was a scar he would carry forever. In the sprawling, opulent room, the sound of the rain drowned out everything else. James stood alone in the vast emptiness, surrounded by luxury but devoid of warmth. And for the first time, he truly understood the loneliness Elena had spoken of. because now it was his to bear. James returned to his usual routine just days after Elena had left, but everything now carried an unfamiliar weight. Sitting in his spacious office on the top floor of Hartley Industries, he faced a mountain of documents awaiting his approval. The cold ticking of the wall clock seemed to mock him, a cruel reminder that time moved forward while his mind remained stuck in another moment entirely. His secretary entered, placing a fresh stack of reports on the desk. James didn't look up. His eyes were fixed on his computer screen, which displayed a photograph from a charity gala he had attended with Elena. In the image, she was smiling faintly, her eyes glowing with warmth as she watched a couple dancing nearby. "Mr. Hartley, these are the financial reports for the last quarter," the secretary murmured, her voice carefully measured to avoid disturbing him. "Leave them," James replied tersely, his voice distant, almost hollow. As the door clicked shut, James leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. His body felt inexplicably heavy, though he hadn't exerted himself all day. Since Elena's departure, even his work, once his greatest passion and purpose, no longer brought him any semblance of satisfaction. That evening, James returned to the vast mansion he called home. The sleek car glided through the iron gates and came to a stop in the gravel driveway. The driver opened his door, but James hesitated, sitting motionless as he stared at the grand entrance. He remembered Elena standing there once, waiting for him to return, an image now relegated to the corners of his memory. Stepping inside, he was met with an oppressive silence. The sound of Elena's light footsteps was absent, as were her soft laughter and the faint scent of jasmine candles she used to light. The house, though still luxurious, felt hauntingly empty, as though mourning her absence alongside him. James wandered into the living room. A sudden gust of wind blew through a window he had forgotten to close, scattering papers from the desk. As he moved to shut it, his gaze fell on a small table by the fireplace. A silver picture frame, dulled with time and coated in a thin layer of dust, caught his attention. He picked up the frame. It held a wedding photo of him and Elena, taken on the day they exchanged vows in a quaint chapel in the countryside. In the photo, Elena wore a flowing white dress, her radiant smile and sparkling eyes full of trust and happiness. James stood beside her, his arm around her waist, gazing at the camera with pride and a rare tenderness. James sank into the nearest chair, the frame still in his hands. Memories flooded back with startling clarity. He recalled their first meeting when Elena had been a passionate young woman with boundless dreams. He remembered their late-night talks about the future, the children they had hoped to have. But he also remembered the light fading from her eyes, the time she tried to tell him how lonely she felt while he brushed her off. "Was I wrong?" James whispered, his voice barely audible, as if he feared the answer. He placed the photo back on the table, but before he could rise, another gust of wind toppled the frame to the floor. The sharp sound of shattering glass echoed through the room, startling him. James knelt to pick it up, carefully gathering the shards. The photo was torn at one corner, but Elena's face remained intact. James stared at her image, his chest tightening painfully. "Broken," he murmured, his voice laced with regret. "Just like everything between us." James stood and placed the fractured frame back on the table. He surveyed the expansive living room, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. For the first time, he wondered what this house would truly be without Elena. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast. James stepped out onto the balcony, carrying a glass of unfinished wine from the previous night. Below him, the city lights shimmered like a sea of jewels. Yet, they brought him no pride, no joy. In his heart, a thought began to take shape, one he couldn't ignore. Perhaps he needed to act, to change, to mend the pieces he had broken before it was too late. Standing under the faint glow of the balcony lights, James wrestled with his emotions. Guilt, regret, and the faintest glimmer of hope. He didn't know if he could rebuild what had been lost, but for the first time in years, he felt a longing for something far greater than success. A longing for the family he had let slip through his fingers. Willow Creek was a quaint little town nestled in a lush green valley, where cobblestone streets wound through fields of wildflowers and charming cottages with red-tiled roofs. It was here that Elena Parker chose to start over, leaving behind the dazzling yet hollow world of the ultra-rich. Her house sat at the end of a quiet lane, surrounded by a white picket fence and a small garden bursting with hydrangeas. The green-painted wooden door opened into a cozy home filled with simple yet vibrant furniture. On the living room walls hung watercolor paintings she and her 7-year-old son, Theo, had created together on rainy afternoons. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, bathing the small space in a warm, golden glow. Elena stood at the stove, flipping pancakes in a skillet. She wore a light floral dress, her hair loosely tied back, her hands moving deftly as the scent of butter and syrup filled the air. Elena, did you ever think you'd find yourself living somewhere so peaceful? The question, posed by her friend Sarah, a colleague from the local elementary school, still echoed in Elena's mind. Sometimes, even she was surprised by how drastically her life had changed. Here, she was no longer the wife of a billionaire, no longer trapped in a sprawling yet soulless mansion, no longer attending lavish parties and engaging in shallow social obligations. Instead, she had become a second-grade teacher, spending her days guiding children through painting, math problems, and storybooks. "Mom, I'm ready." Theo's bright voice pulled her back to the present. The boy bounded down the stairs, his brown hair tousled and his gray eyes sparkling. He wore a red superhero t-shirt and a pair of pristine sneakers he loved to show off to his friends. "All right, superhero, sit down at the table," Elena said with a smile, placing a plate of pancakes in front of him. "Your favorite breakfast today." "You're the best, Mom," Theo exclaimed, eagerly cutting into the fluffy stack and digging in. As she watched him eat, Elena's heart felt lighter. Each day, her joy came from moments like this. The glimmer of excitement in Theo's eyes when he showed her a perfect test score, or the warmth of his hugs during bedtime stories. Life in Willow Creek was worlds apart from the life Elena once knew. Gone were the extravagant gowns, glittering diamonds, and meticulously choreographed galas. Her days now began with birdsong outside her window and ended with the soft hum of crickets in the backyard. At the local elementary school, Elena taught her young students how to count, read, and nurture small plants in the school garden. The work brought her a peace she had never known, though not without its challenges. Sometimes, while standing at the blackboard, an unexpected memory of her old life would surface. It wasn't regret, exactly. More like a tender ache, a scar from a wound that had long since healed but still lingered. When she looked at Theo, memories of James would resurface. Theo didn't just inherit his father's silver-gray eyes. He also shared James's calm intelligence and occasional bursts of determination that left Elena momentarily stunned. Late at night, after tucking Theo into bed, Elena would sit quietly by the window, gazing at the star-studded sky. Her thoughts would drift back to the early days with James, when he was a man who laughed freely, loved deeply, and gave her his undivided attention. She wondered if James ever thought about her, or about the son he had never met. But she would quickly push those thoughts aside. She had made her choice to leave him, and it had been the right one. Still, she couldn't deny that a small corner of her heart remained tethered to James, a truth she would never admit, not even to herself. The morning sunlight spread across Willow Creek, promising a fresh start. Elena leaned down to kiss Theo's messy brown hair before taking his hand and stepping out into the day. With each passing moment, she worked to embrace the peace she had found in this new life, even as the memories of James lingered like a quiet ember, ever present, glowing faintly but never quite extinguished. Elena's small house was always filled with the laughter of Theo, her bright-eyed 7-year-old with an infectious smile and boundless energy. A clever and imaginative child, Theo had a way of turning even the simplest moments into something magical. One afternoon after school, the two of them sat in the small backyard garden. Elena was trimming the hydrangea bushes while Theo lounged on the grass, flipping through a new comic book. "Mom?" Theo suddenly looked up, his gray eyes sparkling with curiosity. "What did you do before we moved here?" Elena froze, her hand stopping mid-air with the garden shears. She hadn't expected the question to come out of nowhere. She smiled faintly, trying to appear composed. "I used to live in a big city," she replied, her tone carefully even. "I had a different job back then, not like what I do now." "Big city like in the movies? With really tall buildings and lots of cars everywhere?" "Yes, just like that," Elena nodded, her gaze flickering briefly to avoid his probing eyes. Theo returned to his comic book, but a few seconds later, he asked another question. "What about my dad? Did he live there too?" The question hit Elena like a jolt. While Theo had never known his father, his curiosity about him had grown over the years. He'd heard his friends talk about going on trips with their dads, learning to play soccer, or having bedtime stories read to them. Sometimes his eyes would linger on Elena, quietly seeking answers she wasn't sure she could give. "Your dad," Elena hesitated, feeling her chest tighten. "Your dad was a very busy man. He worked far away." Theo tilted his head, his silver-gray eyes, so much like James's, studying her intently. "Was he so busy that he couldn't come to see me?" Elena bit her lip, guilt crashing over her like a relentless wave. She had told herself that keeping James and the truth about their relationship hidden was the best way to protect Theo from hurt. But every time she looked into her son's eyes, she felt like a liar. "Maybe one day you'll meet him," Elena said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "When, Mom?" Theo asked, though this time he didn't wait for an answer. He looked back down at his book, leaving Elena with the heavy weight of her unspoken truths. Still, moments with Theo were the greatest source of joy in Elena's life. He was smart, eager to learn, and endlessly curious about the world. That evening, the two of them curled up on the couch, Theo leaning against her as he held a picture book in his small hands. "Tell me another story about superheroes, Mom," he exclaimed excitedly. Elena laughed, wrapping her arms around him. "All right, my little superhero. But this time, you have to promise to go to bed on time." "I promise," Theo declared, his eyes shining like stars. Elena began to tell the story, her voice gentle and warm, weaving a tale that brought a smile to Theo's face. As his eyelids grew heavy, she looked down at him, a fierce wave of love swelling in her chest. He was everything to her, the reason she found the strength to keep going despite the shadows of her past. Later that night, after tucking Theo into bed, Elena sat by the window, her eyes gazing at the starry sky. Inside her, an unspoken battle raged. She knew that hiding the truth about James might be unfair to Theo, but she also feared that revealing it would open a floodgate of questions she wasn't ready to answer. She couldn't deny that James deserved to know about Theo, and Theo deserved to know about James. Yet the thought of confronting him, the man she had once loved and dreamed of building a family with, filled her with dread. "This is for his protection," Elena whispered to herself, as if trying to convince her own heart. "He needs a peaceful life, free from the pain of the past." But deep down, she knew this peace was only temporary. One day, the truth would have to come out, and all she could do was hope she'd have the strength to face it when the time came. As the lights in the little house dimmed, the gentle glow of the moonlight streamed through the window. Elena tiptoed into Theo's room, pressing a tender kiss to his forehead before retreating to her own. The questions Theo had asked that day lingered in her mind, like echoes she couldn't escape, a reminder that the past couldn't stay buried forever. Hartley Industries towered proudly in the heart of the city, a testament to James Hartley's success and power. As chairman and CEO, James had transformed his business empire from a thriving company into a global conglomerate with thousands of employees and projects spanning continents. In the boardrooms, he was revered. Economic magazines hailed him as a business genius, a man who could turn any deal into gold. But behind the brilliance and acclaim, no one knew that James, the man the world admired, was increasingly consumed by an emptiness he couldn't escape. In his expansive office on the top floor of the Hartley Industries building, James sat alone, gazing out at the traffic bustling below. The office was sleek and minimalist, yet exuded opulence. A mahogany desk, walls of floor-to-ceiling glass, and a black leather chair that symbolized absolute authority. Before him lay a thick dossier, the latest contract with a European energy conglomerate. It was a multi-billion-dollar deal he had spent over 6 months negotiating. Yet instead of the thrill that typically accompanied such monumental accomplishments, James felt like a machine, endlessly operating without a clear purpose, save for maintaining his position at the top. His phone buzzed, displaying a familiar name. It was Vivian, a renowned model he had met at a gala a few months ago. "James, I miss you. Can we meet tonight?" Her voice was sugary and alluring. Leaning back in his chair, his cold gaze fixed on the ceiling. "I'm busy," he said curtly, hanging up before she could reply. Relationships like Vivian's were common in his life. Beautiful, captivating women who never stayed for long. James always kept his distance, as though unwilling to let anyone step too close into his world. After the call, James rose and walked toward the bookshelf in the corner of his office. Behind rows of books on business and finance was a small wooden box. Slowly, he opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs he had carefully preserved. He picked up one photograph, and for a moment his steely expression softened. It was a picture of Elena taken that summer, back when they were a young couple full of dreams. She wore a white sundress, her golden hair shimmering in the sunlight, her smile lighting up everything around her. In the years since they parted, James would often revisit this box whenever he felt overwhelmed or lost. It was a silent reminder of a time when his life held something more meaningful, something he had let slip through his fingers. When the workday ended, James returned to his penthouse atop another skyscraper, a residence that screamed luxury and extravagance. The crystal chandelier's glow reflected off marble and glass surfaces, but none of it could erase the emptiness that lingered within. He entered the living room, where expensive artwork adorned the walls and a perfectly arranged leather sofa set awaited. The vast space only amplified the solitude. James uncorked a bottle of whiskey from the bar, pouring himself a glass before settling into the couch. In the dim light of the room, he stared out the window at the city below, its endless lights flickering like tiny stars in a man-made galaxy. For a fleeting moment, James thought of Elena, the woman he once believed would always be by his side. He remembered the nights she waited for him to come home, the way her gentle smile lit up her face as she spoke of simple dreams he had never taken seriously. Is she happy? James wondered aloud, his voice echoing in the hollow room. He took a sip of his whiskey, but the bitterness did nothing to dull the ache inside him. He had everything others coveted: wealth, power, and prestige. But the one thing he could never reclaim was the love Elena had once given him unconditionally. Beside him, the ticking of an elegant clock seemed to grow louder, a constant reminder that time was slipping away. He set the glass down, his eyes drifting to his phone. On the screen was a photo of Elena, the only one he hadn't deleted, the one he kept hidden from everyone else. James stood and moved toward the window. Outside, rain began to fall, the droplets tapping against the glass like a somber melody that matched the hollow feeling within him. As he stared into the rain-soaked city, James felt the weight of his choices bearing down on him, heavier than the empire he had built. Outside the penthouse window, rain poured relentlessly over the city, each drop sliding down the glass in winding trails. The sky was a deep, somber gray, split occasionally by flashes of lightning that illuminated the proud skyscrapers below in fleeting bursts of brilliance. James leaned against the window ledge, a glass of whiskey in hand, his gaze lost in the distant horizon. The city lights reflected faintly in his steel-gray eyes, though they carried no sparkle, only a heavy emptiness. The sound of rain and distant thunder pulled him back to another stormy night in his memory, the night Elena walked out of his life. James closed his eyes, letting the memories flood back like the downpour outside. He could still see her standing in the middle of their vast living room, her eyes brimming with anguish and disappointment. "You don't need me," she had said, her voice trembling yet resolute. "You only need your work, your success, and everything else you think makes you happy. There's no place for me in your life anymore." At the time, James had stood silent, unmoved as though her words couldn't touch him. He had let her go, confident she would come back, but she never did. Now, As he replayed that moment, James felt a tightening in his chest. He realized how arrogant he had been, how he had taken her love for granted. He never believed there would come a day when Elena would truly be gone. James set his glass down on the sleek coffee table and took a step back, his eyes still fixed on the rain-streaked window. The same haunting questions echoed in his mind, relentless as the storm outside. Was it all worth it? He had everything others envied: wealth, power, prestige. But standing at the pinnacle, James felt nothing but isolation. No one truly understood him, and no one entered his world without ulterior motives. Elena had been the one person who gave him a sense of belonging, a warmth that made the vastness of his life feel meaningful. And he had let her slip away, a mistake he couldn't undo. James inhaled deeply, willing himself to push the suffocating emotions aside. He needed to act, to do something, anything, to escape the hollow void inside him. Picking up his phone, James dialed Stephen, his most trusted associate. "Stephen," he said, his tone firm, "I need you to organize a charity gala. Extravagant, grand, something unforgettable." "Of course, Mr. Hartley. Any specific requests for the guest list?" Stephen asked. James hesitated for a moment, his eyes drifting back to the storm outside. "Invite everyone important in business, art, and politics. I want this to be the biggest event of the year." "Understood. I'll get started immediately." Ending the call, James set the phone down on the table, his gaze returning to the rain. He wasn't sure if the gala would make him feel any better, but at least it gave him something to occupy his mind. If he kept himself busy enough, perhaps he wouldn't have time to dwell on the things he had lost. The rain began to ease, though the penthouse remained as cold and silent as before. James stood motionless by the window, his thoughts adrift. Beneath his commanding exterior and composed demeanor, James was a man weighed down by profound loneliness, a void no lavish gala, no billion-dollar deal could ever fill. The upcoming event would immerse him in a sea of lights, praise, and applause. Yet deep down, James knew none of it could replace the light that Elena had once brought into his life. The Grand Hall of the Grand Avalon Hotel, one of the city's most opulent venues, glittered under the dazzling light of massive crystal chandeliers that hung from its impossibly high ceilings. The light reflected off mirrored walls and gleamed on polished marble floors, casting an ethereal glow over the scene. Round banquet tables dressed in pristine white linens were adorned with elegant arrangements of white orchids in delicate crystal vases. Gilded menus printed on fine art paper rested beside polished silver cutlery and sparkling champagne flutes. Every detail was meticulously curated, from the shimmer of the glasses to the harmonious melodies played by the symphony orchestra in the corner. The guests, the most powerful figures in business, politics, and the arts, mingled in small, exclusive circles. Impeccably tailored suits and glamorous evening gowns created a tableau of effortless luxury. James Hartley stood near the entrance, a glass of red wine in his hand, his gaze calm and watchful as it swept over the crowd. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, the sharp lines of the fabric accentuating his tall frame and air of authority. "Mr. Hartley, this event is truly spectacular." An older businessman approached, his tone warm with admiration. "You always know how to create an evening no one can forget." James returned the compliment with a polite smile and a nod. "Thank you. I hope tonight brings more than just luxury. I hope it makes a real difference." His words were measured and appropriate, but deep down, James knew he didn't truly care about the evening. This was just another event in a long line of carefully orchestrated affairs, a calculated exercise to bolster his image, forge connections, and fill the growing void within him that he couldn't bear to face. As the orchestra concluded its set, the lights dimmed, drawing attention to the grand stage at the center of the hall. A voice over the speakers announced James Hartley as the evening's keynote speaker. James ascended the stage with practiced confidence, his commanding presence immediately capturing the attention of every person in the room. Holding the microphone, he paused for a moment, scanning the faces of his audience before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his deep, resonant voice carrying across the hall. Tonight, we gather here, not just for an extraordinary evening, but for a cause that transcends us all, to provide hope and opportunity for children who need it most. The room fell silent, every ear attuned to his words. James elaborated on the evening's mission, raising funds for a non-profit organization dedicated to improving education for underprivileged children. His delivery was persuasive and heartfelt. Yet beneath the surface, a question gnawed at him. Was this truly meaningful, or was it just another beautiful facade to mask his emptiness? Thank you all for being here tonight, James concluded with a faint smile. Together, I hope we can make a lasting difference. Applause erupted as James stepped down from the stage. He accepted handshakes, congratulations, and praise from the attendees with the same practiced grace. But as the lights brightened and the hum of conversations resumed, he felt a strange detachment, a solitary observer in the midst of his own carefully constructed spectacle. Taking a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, James leaned against a marble pillar at the edge of the room. His gaze wandered over the crowd, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere. These people, no matter how powerful or wealthy, were all just players in a game he had mastered long ago. James knew how to charm them, how to control every situation, but the shallow conversations and empty flattery left him cold. His eyes skimmed over a nearby group of guests before pausing abruptly. A peculiar feeling surged within him, an unease, as though the air itself had shifted. It was a sensation he couldn't ignore, a premonition of change, something just beyond his control. Unbeknownst to James, within moments, the arrival of a woman from his past would shatter the carefully built walls of his world, setting in motion a chain of events that would alter everything he thought he knew. The grand ballroom buzzed with lively conversations and soft laughter, the atmosphere enhanced by the gentle strains of the orchestra playing in the background. But when the main doors swung open, a subtle breeze seemed to ripple through the room, heralding the entrance of a woman whose presence made every gaze halt in its path. Elena stepped inside, exuding elegance and quiet confidence. She wore a floor-length black gown, minimalist in design, with a modestly deep neckline that highlighted her delicate collarbones and graceful shoulders. No jewels adorned her except for the soft glow of her striking blue eyes beneath dark lashes. Her golden hair was swept into a high chignon, revealing her refined features and a poised, understated smile. She wasn't the type of woman who drew attention through ostentation, but rather through an effortless sophistication that immediately captivated the room. Murmurs spread quickly among the crowd. "Who is she? I don't think I've seen her before," one businessman whispered to his companion, his gaze fixed on Elena. "She doesn't seem like the usual type to frequent events like this," another guest remarked, his tone tinged with curiosity. Unfazed by the attention, Elena moved through the room with measured steps, each one deliberate yet fluid. The crystal chandeliers overhead cast a shimmering light onto her black gown, accentuating her graceful movements. From across the room, James stood by a tall window, a champagne flute in hand. His eyes idly scanned the crowd until they landed on her. He froze. At first, James thought it was a trick of his mind, but when Elena's gaze briefly met his, he knew she was real. This was no illusion. The world around him seemed to come to a standstill. The hum of conversation, the strains of the orchestra, even the dazzling lights, all of it faded into a distant blur as a storm of emotions surged within him. Elena, her name escaped his lips, barely above a whisper, a sound only he could hear. James felt an overwhelming wave of emotions, shock, confusion, and something achingly familiar that he couldn't quite name. He had long resigned himself to the thought that he would never see her again. Yet here she was, standing among the glittering crowd, shining like a beacon in a vast, unending sea. Elena felt his eyes on her from across the room. She had prepared for this moment for days, steeling herself for the inevitable meeting. But as she finally stood face to face with him, her heart raced in a way she hadn't anticipated. Still, she didn't let it show. Elena kept her composure, offering polite smiles to nearby guests as she continued deeper into the ballroom. James couldn't tear his eyes away from her. She was different now, not the gentle, eager-to-please woman he had once known. Instead, she radiated a quiet strength, the kind that came from finding oneself after years of being lost. When Elena reached the center of the room, she paused, turning just enough to meet James's gaze head-on. In that fleeting moment, the grand ballroom seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them in its vast expanse. James set his champagne flute down on a nearby table without hesitation. His steps were deliberate, his focus unshakable as he crossed the room toward her. Though his stride was steady, his heart thundered in his chest with each passing second. Elena stood her ground, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "James," she said before he could speak, her voice calm yet piercing, slicing through the silence that seemed to hang between them. "Elena," James replied, her name heavy with emotions he couldn't quite articulate. Why are you here?" Elena tilted her head slightly, her blue eyes glinting with an enigmatic spark. "We'll talk," she said, her voice low but firm. "Just not here." James blinked, taken aback by the cryptic nature of her response. Before he could ask for clarity, Elena turned on her heel and walked away, leaving him standing amidst the murmuring crowd with a flood of unanswered questions swirling in his mind. James stood frozen in the center of the grand ballroom, his eyes fixed on Elena's retreating figure as she wove through the crowd. She moved with an elegance that seemed to part the sea of people around her, heading toward the balcony where the glow of the chandeliers softened, giving way to the quiet intimacy of the night air. Elena paused at the glass railing, the city lights below twinkling like countless tiny stars. She stood tall, her golden hair catching the soft breeze, her shoulders steady despite the weight of the moment. James knew there was no avoiding this. He moved quickly, his steps purposeful, though his heart pounded with the anticipation of what was to come. "Elena," he said as he reached her, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of everything he hadn't said before. Elena turned to face him, her expression calm and composed, her blue eyes as unreadable as a still lake. "James," she replied, a faint, controlled smile gracing her lips. For a moment, James felt the world fade away. The music, the chatter, the dazzling lights, all of it dimmed into insignificance. All he could see was her, the woman he had once let slip through his fingers, now standing before him with a quiet strength that left him breathless. "You're here why?" James asked, his voice laced with equal parts surprise and wariness. Elena reached for a glass of wine from a nearby table, taking a small sip before answering. "Why I'm here doesn't matter, James. What matters is, I need to talk to you." "Then talk," James urged, his gaze intent on her, his outward calm belying the storm of emotions brewing within. Setting her glass down, Elena locked eyes with him, her blue gaze sharp and unwavering. "It's been 7 years, James. 7 years since I left, and you never came looking for me. I've asked myself over and over what that means." James clenched his fist at his side, willing himself to remain composed. "You left without a word, Elena. Did you not think I deserved to know why?" Elena's lips curved into a bitter smile, tinged with sadness. "And if I had told you, would you have listened? Did you ever truly listen to me, James?" Her words cut deeper than James wanted to admit. He couldn't deny the truth in them. How he had been so consumed by his work and ambitions that he had neglected the woman who had once been his everything. Elena exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering as though she were shedding a heavy burden. She reached in her clutch and pulled out a white envelope, placing it firmly in James's hand. "This is for you," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. James looked down at the envelope, its weight somehow heavier than any contract he had ever held. His name, James Hartley, was written in a familiar hand across the front, the sight of it stirring something deep within him. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. Elena met his gaze, her expression unwavering yet tinged with sorrow. "It's the answer you deserve, but I'm not going to explain it here. Read it when you're alone." James stared at her, searching her face for some hint of what she meant, some glimmer of the emotions she might still hold for him. But Elena's calm exterior betrayed nothing. I've thought long and hard before making this decision, she continued, her tone soft but sharp as a blade. Not because I wanted to see you again, but because there are truths that can't remain hidden forever. What truths? James pressed, his voice dropping to a hushed intensity, as if trying to force her to reveal more. Elena shook her head, taking a step back. You'll know soon enough, James. But tonight, enjoy your party. Don't let me ruin it. With that, she turned away, leaving James rooted to the spot, the envelope still clutched in his hand. He wanted to call her back, to demand she explain right there and then, but the words caught in his throat. James looked down at the envelope, his fingers brushing over the writing on its surface. He hesitated, torn between the urge to tear it open and the fear of what he might find inside. Elena disappeared through the ballroom doors, her silhouette fading into the dimly lit hallway. James felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The envelope in his hand held the answers he had been seeking for years, but with it came the weight of everything he had been avoiding. The world around him spun, the chatter and music of the ballroom a distant hum in his ears. James stood alone, the envelope a heavy reminder that Elena's return was no coincidence, and that the past he had tried to bury was about to rise to the surface. James stood motionless by the balcony railing, the glittering city lights below failing to illuminate the turmoil churning within him. In his hand, the letter Elena had just given him seemed to sear through his thoughts, leaving behind an endless string of unanswered questions. Though James was no stranger to making monumental decisions and navigating the most challenging circumstances, he realized he was entirely unprepared for this moment. He stared at the white envelope in his hand, his name written neatly in Elena's familiar handwriting. Just a name, yet it carried the weight of a past he had tried so hard to bury. James tightened his grip on the letter, his mind a battlefield of conflicting urges. Part of him wanted to rip it open immediately, desperate to uncover its contents. But another part hesitated, fearing that once the truth was revealed, nothing would ever be the same. Behind him, the party continued unabated. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the soft hum of the orchestra all blended into an indistinct backdrop. Yet for James, the world had come to a standstill the moment Elena placed the letter in his hand. James? A voice broke through the haze, pulling him back to the present. It was Stephen, his trusted associate, approaching with a look of concern. Are you all right? Stephen asked, his gaze flickering briefly to the envelope in James's hand. James quickly slid the letter into his jacket pocket, reasserting his composed demeanor. I'm fine, just needed some air. Stephen hesitated, studying him for a moment before nodding. If you need anything, I'm here. James gave a curt nod, waiting for Stephen to retreat before turning his attention back toward the grand doors of the ballroom. Through the crowd, he spotted Elena. She was walking away, her poised and graceful demeanor unchanged. But this time, James noticed something he hadn't before. She wasn't looking back. A wave of abandonment washed over him, as vivid memories of the night she left him 7 years ago collided with the present. The lines between past and present blurred, leaving James momentarily disoriented. Elena stepped through the ballroom's grand doors, her silhouette vanishing behind the marble walls, leaving James standing in a haze of unspoken emotions. He touched the pocket of his jacket, where the letter rested like a stone against his heart. He knew that opening it would provide the answers he sought. But was he truly ready to face them? Inside him, a storm raged, a tempest of confusion, anger, and an ache of regret he refused to acknowledge. James glanced back at the crowd, the powerful and affluent mingling as if nothing beyond their immediate world mattered. Yet for him, that world now felt hollow, devoid of meaning without Elena. Finally, James turned and walked away from the dazzling lights and empty praise. He needed silence, space to process what had just unfolded, and to decide if he had the courage to open the letter that could change everything. James's penthouse was cloaked in absolute silence. The soft glow of a single table lamp cast long shadows across the glass walls, reflecting his solitary figure seated on the expansive leather sofa. A glass of untouched whiskey rested on the table beside him, but James paid it no mind. In his hands was the letter Elena had given him, still sealed in its pristine, white envelope. His fingers tightened around the edge, his eyes fixed on it, as if the envelope itself held the power to upend everything he knew. Finally, he exhaled deeply and carefully opened it. The delicate sheet of paper inside slid free, and Elena's familiar handwriting came to life under the soft light. James began to read, his eyes scanning each word, each line, every one cutting deeper into the armor he had worn for so long. The letter, James, I spent countless nights deciding whether or not to write this letter. I thought perhaps it wasn't necessary, that the past could remain buried forever. But I've come to realize that the truth cannot be hidden, and our son, Theo, deserves to know his father. Yes, James, Theo is your son. He's 7 now, smart, strong, and with eyes that mirror yours. I've done my best to fill the void your absence left in his life, but I know I can never truly replace the role of a father. James, he needs you, not just out of obligation, but because he deserves the love and care of his father. Before you decide to step into his life, I need you to think carefully. Are you ready to be a father? Not just in name, but with all your heart and soul. James read the letter over and over, his gaze locked on the page as though it were a lifeline. The name of the boy echoed in his mind, Theo, his son. James leaned back in the sofa, the letter slipping onto his lap, though his eyes stayed fixed on it. Memories from years ago surged forward like an unstoppable tide. Elena laughing radiantly on their wedding day, her gentle hand resting on her stomach as she spoke of their dreams of having children. He had missed it all. His heart thundered in his chest. And for the first time in years, James didn't feel like the powerful man who controlled every aspect of his world. He felt unmoored, adrift in a reality he had never prepared for. Why didn't she tell me? James murmured, his voice laced with a mixture of anger and anguish. 7 years of his life had passed without him knowing he had a son. Yet amidst the shock and confusion, another emotion began to surface, a deep, surging wave of regret and longing. He couldn't stop thinking about Theo, about the image of a boy with his eyes, about all the moments he had missed. James rose to his feet, gripping the letter tightly, and walked to the window. The city lights sparkled against the night sky, but to him, they were nothing more than a blurred haze. He looked down at the letter again, rereading one line. He needs you, not just out of obligation, but because he deserves the love and care of his father. James knew this wasn't like any decision he'd ever made in the boardroom. He couldn't solve this with power or wealth. This was about love, responsibility, and becoming a father, something he had never truly imagined himself being. A spark of determination ignited within him. He didn't know how Elena would react or how Theo would respond, but one thing was clear. He had to meet his son. James couldn't sit still. The letter from Elena lay on the table, but its words were etched into his mind, pushing him into a state of restlessness he could no longer contain. Grabbing his car keys, he left the penthouse without hesitation, leaving behind the glittering city lights and the extravagant party he had just hosted. The car glided through dark, rain-slicked streets, the windshield wipers moving rhythmically to clear his view. But James's thoughts weren't on the road. They were consumed by an image he hadn't dared to imagine before, a boy named Theo. The small house sat at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by a white picket fence and a garden blooming with hydrangeas. Under the dim glow of the streetlights, the place was a stark contrast to the opulence James was used to. Stepping out of the car, he barely noticed the gentle rain still falling. With each step closer to the house, his heart pounded, not out of fear, but from a strange, unnameable emotion that gripped him tightly. James stood at the door, his hand gripping the brass handle, but he didn't knock right away. He needed a moment to steady himself. The waiting became unbearable, and finally, he raised his hand and knocked. The sound echoed in the stillness of the night. The door opened, and there stood Elena. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, her hair cascading naturally over her shoulders. When she saw James, her eyes flickered with surprise, but she quickly composed herself. "James," she said, her voice calm but laced with a hint of wariness. "What are you doing here?" James didn't answer immediately. He stared at Elena, searching her expression for something, anything, but her gaze was firm and unreadable. "I need to see Theo," James said, his voice low but resolute. Elena frowned slightly, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door behind her, as if shielding the space inside from James's intrusion. "You can't," she replied firmly. A wave of frustration surged through James, but he held it back. "He's my son," he said, his eyes burning with determination. "I have a right to see him." Elena crossed her arms and met his gaze head-on. "James, being a father isn't just about knowing you have a child. That right comes from care, love, and the things you've never shown in the past 7 years. You never gave me a chance," James countered, his voice edged with both anger and hurt. "You left without a word. How was I supposed to fulfill my responsibility if I didn't even know I had a child? And now you want to fulfill that responsibility just because you know?" Elena shot back, her tone sharp and unyielding. "My son doesn't need a father who shows up out of obligation, James. He needs someone who's there because they truly love him." James froze. He didn't have an answer because deep down, he knew Elena was right. He had lost 7 years of Theo's life, and he couldn't erase that with a single appearance. "Elena," James said after a long pause, his voice softening, almost pleading, "let me meet him. Just once." Elena shook her head, her eyes steady and unflinching. "Not now, James. Before you step into Theo's life, I need to know you're truly ready. If you want to be his father, you need to prove that you can love him, that you won't turn him into just another piece of your calculated, controlled world." James stood silently, his hand falling to his side as if all the strength had drained from him. Elena held his gaze for a moment longer before stepping back and placing her hand on the doorknob. "Go home, James," she said, her voice gentle but resolute. "If you truly want to be part of Theo's life, prove it. Not with words, but with actions." The door closed softly, leaving James alone in the rain. He didn't feel the cold drops falling on his skin. His mind was consumed by the image of a boy named Theo, a boy he had never met, but who now occupied every corner of his thoughts. James stood in the rain, his eyes fixed on the door that had just closed. But he wasn't ready to give up. He raised his hand and knocked again, this time louder, more determined. The door opened once more, and Elena appeared. Her eyes no longer held surprise, but instead a weariness that settled on her face like a shadow. "James, you shouldn't be here," she said softly but firmly. "We're not done, Elena," James replied, his voice a mix of anger and pain he couldn't contain. "You can't just hand me a letter, tell me I have a son, and then shut the door like this." Elena stepped out of the doorway, her emotions now unguarded. "Do you think knowing you have a son is enough to step into his life, James? He needs more than that." James met her gaze, her words cutting into a deep wound he hadn't realized was there. "I'm not asking for much," he said, his tone lowering, almost pleading. "I just want to see him, just once." Elena shook her head, stepping further onto the porch, her arms crossing tightly in front of her. "James, do you understand what will happen if you meet Theo now? He doesn't know who you are. You'll step into his life, confuse him, and then what? If you don't stay, he'll lose more than you can imagine." James felt as though his heart was being crushed. "I have no intention of leaving," he said, his voice resolute. "I want to do my part. I want to be his father." "Being a father isn't a role you can take on just because you want to," Elena interrupted, her eyes glistening with pain. "He needs a father who loves him, who's willing to sacrifice for him. Not someone who walks into his life only to leave again when they feel their duty is done." Her words left James momentarily stunned. He had always been confident in his ability to control everything, deals, relationships, even his own emotions. But now, he realized that this time, everything was beyond his grasp. James took a small step back, his gaze locked on hers. Do you think I don't care? He asked, his voice low but laden with anguish. Do you think I don't regret missing these 7 years? Elena didn't respond immediately. She took a deep breath, her expression softening slightly, though her resolve remained. James, I don't doubt that you care. But Theo needs more than that. He needs to know his father is there for him. Not out of obligation, but because you truly love him. I do love him, James whispered, his voice breaking, his eyes filled with turmoil. I've never met him, but I already know. I can't explain it, but I know I want to be part of his life. Elena studied him, her gaze flickering with a trace of tenderness before she turned away, as if unwilling to let him see her vulnerability. Do you know what it feels like, Elena? James continued, his voice hoarse. When I read that letter, my entire world flipped upside down. 7 years, Elena. I've missed 7 years. How am I supposed to live with that? Elena turned back to him, her eyes gentler now. James, that's why I gave you the letter, to let you know he exists, to give you the chance to be in his life. But you have to understand, this isn't something you can control like a business deal. I don't want control, James said, his voice growing softer, more vulnerable. I just want to fix what I've broken. I want to do the right thing, not just for Theo, but for myself too. Elena regarded him for a long moment, then let out a quiet sigh. James, I'm not stopping you, but you have to prove that you're ready. Not to me, but to Theo. James stood silently as Elena turned and walked back inside, her words echoing in his mind. The rain began to lighten, but inside James, a storm continued to rage. He didn't know how he would prove what Elena needed him to, but one thing was certain. He couldn't turn his back on this chance. James stood still under the rain that had now softened to a gentle drizzle. Elena's words echoed in his mind, not as a dismissal, but as a challenge, a chance he could not afford to lose. The path before him was no longer about power, prestige, or the battles of the corporate world he had mastered. This was about love, care, and responsibility, things he once believed he didn't need to learn. But now, for Theo, he was willing to do whatever it took. James pulled out his phone, his fingers hesitating momentarily before scrolling to Stephen's contact. The call connected after just a few rings. Stephen, I need you to look into Elena's life over the past 7 years, James said, his voice low and firm. Be discreet. I don't want her to know. There was a pause on the other end before Stephen asked, anything specific I should focus on? No, just make sure I have everything I need, James replied, his tone decisive. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his gaze fixed on the small house before him. He knew he couldn't go inside, couldn't meet his son just yet, but he wouldn't let that stop him. The night in Willow Creek was so quiet that Elena could hear the soft rustle of the breeze brushing through the hydrangeas on the porch. The gentle glow of a single lamp in the living room cast its light against the window pane, where she sat in quiet reflection. On the table beside her, a cup of tea still steamed faintly, but Elena paid it no mind. She had just tucked Theo into bed, watching him sleep so peacefully. She couldn't stop the tide of memories flooding her mind, carrying her back to a time when she truly believed happiness was eternal. Elena remembered the first time she met James. Back then, he was a young man full of ambition and confidence, his eyes always alight when he spoke of grand plans. That spark was what had drawn her in, the determination and undeniable magnetism he exuded. She could still recall their first date, when James had taken her to a quaint little restaurant tucked away on a quiet street. He wasn't just an ambitious man. He was someone who knew how to make her laugh and who listened intently to the smallest details of her stories. I'm going to build a life where we'll never have to worry about anything, James had said, his eyes shining like stars. At the time, Elena had believed every word. She had thought they would create a happy family together, one where love would be the glue that held everything in place. But things began to change. James threw himself into his work, inch by inch building the empire he had always dreamed of. Each milestone he reached came at the expense of another piece of the time they once shared. Elena remembered the countless evenings she spent alone in their sprawling mansion. Lavish dinners were set out on a long dining table, but her only companions were silence and the echo of her own thoughts. She had tried to tell James how she felt. One night, When he came home late from yet another marathon meeting, she waited for him in the living room. "James, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze resolute. "What is it, Elena?" James replied, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of his phone rather than on her. "Elena, I'm doing all of this for us," James would explain whenever she questioned the time he dedicated to work. "I need to make sure you'll never have to worry about anything." But what James didn't understand was that the only thing she truly needed wasn't wealth or grandiose houses. It was him. There was one evening Elena could never forget. It was their wedding anniversary. She had spent the entire day preparing a special dinner, lighting candles throughout the room, and slipping into the dress James had once told her was his favorite. But as the clock struck 8, then 9, James was nowhere to be seen. He came home at 11, his face drawn and his tone detached. "I'm sorry, Elena. Work ran late tonight." She tried not to cry, but when James walked past her without noticing the nearly burnt-out candles or the untouched dinner on the table, Elena felt something inside her shatter. She realized then that in James's life, she was no longer a priority. His work, his social engagements, and his ambition had taken up all the space in his heart. Elena gazed out at the night beyond the window, her eyes reflecting a profound sadness. She had loved James with all her heart, and she knew he had once loved her, too. But love wasn't always enough to keep two people together. Those years had been a constant battle for Elena. She had wanted to believe that James would change, that he would recognize what he was losing. But the longer she waited, the deeper she sank into her own loneliness. When she discovered she was pregnant, Elena hoped that the arrival of a child might bring them closer. Instead, it only highlighted their growing distance. James remained consumed by his work, leaving Elena to face the challenges of pregnancy and the fears of the future alone. Eventually, Elena understood that she couldn't go on living that way. She loved James, but she also knew she had to leave to save herself and their child. Back in the present, Elena's hands trembled slightly as she thought about those memories. But this time, they didn't sting as sharply as they once had. Time had helped her heal, and Theo had become the light of her life. Yet, deep down, Elena knew the scars still lingered. And every time she looked into Theo's eyes, the same steel-gray eyes that mirrored James's, she couldn't help but wonder, did James realize what he had lost? James sat in the silence of his office on the top floor of Hartley Tower. The dim light from his desk lamp reflected off the towering glass walls, creating an invisible barrier that seemed to separate him from the bustling world outside. On his desk lay Elena's letter, the words on the page etched vividly into his mind, burning with a truth he could no longer ignore. Leaning back in his chair, James stared out at the night sky. The city below glimmered with the vibrant glow of skyscrapers and streetlights. But to him, the scene was nothing more than a muted blur, devoid of meaning. James closed his eyes, and memories he had tried to bury came rushing back, uninvited and relentless. He thought of the early days with Elena, when she was a young woman full of passion and hope, her smile bright enough to make the world feel lighter. He remembered the first time she shared her dream of a happy family. "I don't need a mansion or fancy cars, James. I just need you by my side, building a home together," she had said. Back then, James had smiled, taking her hand in his. "I'll give you everything," he'd promised. "You'll never have to worry about anything." But reality had unraveled those promises. Instead of building the home Elena had envisioned, James had thrown himself into his work, believing it was the best way to protect her, to ensure she never faced financial insecurity. What he failed to see was that Elena didn't want grand homes or extravagant trips. She wanted him. James's chest tightened as he remembered the times Elena had tried to pull him back into the present. Once, she had prepared a lavish dinner to celebrate his success in closing a major deal. She wore the red dress he loved, her smile radiant as he walked into the dining room. But he barely glanced at her, mumbling something about being too tired and needing to rest for an early meeting. He didn't notice as her smile faded, replaced by an unspoken sadness he had grown accustomed to overlooking. There was also the night she sat waiting for him in the living room, her hands clutching a glass of wine as she said, "James, I don't know if I can keep doing this." I feel so alone, even when you're here." Instead of truly hearing her, James had dismissed her pain with cold, logical reassurances. "Elena, you have to understand. Everything I do is for us." James gripped the armrest of his chair tightly, his eyes fixed on the faint glow of the city lights beyond the window. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully accept the truth he had avoided for years. He had been wrong, not just in the small, everyday moments, but in the way he had treated the woman he once loved with all his heart. He had failed her. James reached for Elena's letter, the words searing through his mind again. Theo needs a father who loves him, not just a symbol of power or duty. He couldn't deny that he had spent years living like a machine, chasing success and wealth without pause. And now, faced with the realization that he had missed 7 years of his son's life, James felt an indescribable ache. Rising from his chair, James walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, placing a hand on the cold glass as he looked down at the glittering city below. For the first time in his life, the lights didn't fill him with pride or a sense of achievement. Instead, they only made him painfully aware of the emptiness inside. Letting out a long breath, James clenched his fists. "I will make this right," he whispered, his voice carrying a quiet but unyielding determination. His reflection in the glass stared back at him. But this time, it wasn't the face of a powerful CEO, it was that of a man ready to reclaim what truly mattered. Late at night, both Elena and James found themselves consumed by their own thoughts. In her small home in Willow Creek, Elena sat by the window, gazing at the starry sky, her heart heavy with bittersweet memories. Meanwhile, in his expansive office atop Hartley Tower, James stared blankly at the blurred city lights reflecting off the glass in front of him. Though separated by distance and time, their minds were both anchored in the past, haunted by moments when they could have saved their marriage, but where words remained buried beneath an unspoken chasm. Elena remembered the times she tried to reach James. Once, she had waited for him in the living room, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped a glass of wine. When he finally walked in, looking worn and distracted, she mustered every ounce of courage she had to speak. "James, we need to talk. I feel like—" But before she could finish, he raised a hand, his eyes glued to his phone. "Elena, can this wait?" "I'm exhausted," he said. The words she had prepared so carefully died in her throat. She nodded silently, swallowing her emotions. But deep down, Elena knew that the space between them was growing, and James didn't even notice. James, too, remembered the quiet sadness in Elena's eyes, moments when she had silently pleaded for him to say something, to bridge the gap, yet he chose to stay silent. He recalled that morning when Elena sat by the window of their grand estate, staring into the garden with a distant, empty expression. He had walked up behind her, intending to place a hand on her shoulder, to say something meaningful, but he stopped short. James had never been good at expressing emotions. Instead of offering words of love, he let work dominate every conversation. He believed his actions were enough to prove his love, but he failed to understand that Elena needed to hear the words, to feel his presence, not just see it represented in lavish gifts or financial security. The memories flooded them both, broken shards of their past cutting into their present. Elena thought back to the birthday dinner she had prepared for James. She had cooked his favorite dishes, set the table with candles and flowers, hoping it would be an opportunity to reconnect. But James came home late that night, offering a brief apology and a distracted glance at the beautifully set table. She smiled, hiding her disappointment, but when he left the table after only a few minutes, Elena knew her efforts had been forgotten. James remembered seeing Elena crying in their bedroom, her face buried in her hands. He had stood at the doorway, wanted to go to her, to apologize and promise to do better. But instead, he walked away, convincing himself that he'd address it later. But later never came. The ghosts of the past. That night, both Elena and James were confronted by the ghosts of their shared history. Elena couldn't deny that, even after leaving James and finding peace with Theo, there were still nights when she wondered if things could have been different. If she had been more patient, if James had realized sooner, could they have saved their marriage? For James, It felt as though he were reliving every moment he had lost. He had believed Elena's silence was agreement, that she understood and accepted what he was doing. But now, he realized her silence wasn't consent. It was surrender, a giving up of hope that he would ever change. They both understood that to mend the present, they would have to confront the past. The wounds they inflicted on one another couldn't be erased, but perhaps they could be lessons for building something new. Elena looked out at the moonlight streaming through her window, her hands tightening around her cup of tea. Deep down, she resolved that, even if she could never return to James, she wouldn't stop him from stepping into Theo's life, if he truly changed. James, in a different corner of the city, stared at Elena's letter once more. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about winning or proving himself. He was thinking about Theo and how he could start over, not to fix the past but to create a new future. James sat in his office, the light from his computer screen casting a pale glow across his face. But this time, it wasn't spreadsheets or financial reports holding his attention. In front of him were small plans he had spent the entire night sketching. Ways to begin anew, step by step, to become the father Theo deserved and the man Elena might trust again. He was accustomed to drafting strategies for billion-dollar projects, yet for the first time, James felt truly out of his depth. How does one approach a 7-year-old boy he's never met, but who carries his blood? How does one prove to Elena that he was genuinely ready to change? Not with words, but through actions. Closing his notebook, James's eyes hardened with resolve. He understood that this time, money and power wouldn't solve the problem. What was required were small, honest acts that could rebuild trust. In Willow Creek, Elena sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She gazed out the window at her small garden, glittering in the soft morning sunlight. Their meeting with James had left her restless. Even after all these years, the image of him remained vivid in her mind. His determined eyes and steady voice laced with a hint of desperation when he'd asked to meet Theo. Elena couldn't deny the profound impact James had had on her life. And now, he was trying to make his way back in. But had he truly changed? Would his presence bring something good into Theo's life? Or would it only complicate things further? She sighed, setting her tea down. Deep down, Elena knew that whether she liked it or not, Theo deserved the chance to know his father. But to open that door again, she needed to see something from James that he had never shown before: patience and genuine sincerity. A week later, James returned to Willow Creek. This time, he didn't go to Elena's house. Instead, he visited the elementary school where Theo was enrolled, observing the boy quietly from a distance. James saw Theo playing with his friends on the schoolyard, his eyes shining and his smile radiant. James couldn't tear his gaze away from the boy, feeling something both strange and deeply familiar stir inside him. Rather than rushing in, James decided to start small. He funded a new classroom and sports equipment for the school, deliberately keeping his involvement anonymous. He wanted Theo to benefit from these changes without feeling overwhelmed or burdened by his sudden presence. James also reached out to Elena, offering to support her in raising Theo. "I don't want to interfere, Elena," he said during a phone call. "I just want to help you and Theo in whatever way you feel comfortable." Elena was silent for a moment before replying. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice soft but not entirely cold. Elena began to notice changes in James. He no longer pushed or demanded. Instead, he was patient, respecting the space she and Theo needed. It made her wonder, had James truly changed? One afternoon, as she and Theo strolled through the park, she spotted James sitting on a bench nearby. He didn't approach, merely offering a faint smile when their eyes met. "Who's that, Mom?" Theo asked, his curious eyes fixed on James. Elena hesitated for a moment, but then smiled, brushing Theo's hair gently. "Just an old acquaintance, sweetheart." James watched them walk away, his heart aching but his feet remaining rooted to the ground. He knew that to rebuild this relationship, time was the first gift he needed to offer. The small cafe in the heart of Willow Creek sat quietly at the corner of the street, with rustic wooden tables and large windows overlooking the road. Warm yellow light from the hanging bulbs created an ambience that was both intimate and serene. James stepped inside, his impeccably tailored suit starkly out of place in the cozy, unpretentious surroundings. But he didn't care. His eyes scanned the room quickly, landing on a table near the window where Elena and Theo sat. Elena turned at the sound of the doorbell chiming. When she saw James, she gave him a small nod, an unspoken acknowledgement, while Theo remained engrossed in his cup of hot chocolate. James approached the table, his steps feeling heavier than usual. As he drew closer, Theo lifted his head, his curious gaze locking onto James. James froze momentarily. Those eyes, gray and piercing, were unmistakably his own. The sharpness of their shared gaze and the subtle flicker of thoughtfulness were like staring at a younger version of himself. The realization hit him harder than he expected, tightening his chest. "Hello, Theo," James said, his voice warm but tinged with nervousness. Theo studied him for a moment, tilting his head as though trying to assess the man standing before him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with curiosity. James glanced at Elena, silently asking for help. She offered a gentle smile, placing a hand on Theo's shoulder. "Theo, this is Mr. James. He wanted to meet you and talk for a little while." "Why?" Theo asked, his sharp eyes still fixed on James. James sat down across from him, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Because I'd like to know more about you, Theo. And because you're very special." A brief silence hung in the air, stretching into what felt like an eternity. For the first time in his life, James found himself at a loss for words. Negotiating billion-dollar deals and defusing tense boardroom conflicts had always come naturally to him. But here, facing this small boy, he felt utterly unprepared. Elena watched the interaction quietly, her expression a mixture of concern and cautious hope. She nudged Theo's hot chocolate closer. "Drink up, sweetheart, before it gets cold." Theo took a small sip, his eyes darting toward James over the rim of his mug. "What do you like?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. James smiled, surprised but relieved at the question. "I like a lot of things, but lately I've been learning to enjoy music more." "What about you, Theo? What do you like?" Theo tilted his head, considering. "I like drawing, and I like playing the piano." "The piano?" James raised his eyebrows, his interest piqued. "How long have you been playing?" "For a while now. Mom says I'm like Grandma because she loved playing the piano too," Theo replied, his voice carrying a hint of pride. James glanced at Elena, catching her gaze. Though unspoken, he understood the depth of her influence in Theo's life, a life James had missed entirely. "What do you do?" Theo asked, his curiosity breaking through his earlier shyness. James chuckled, leaning slightly forward. "I work in business. I help big companies solve their problems. Does that mean you're important?" Theo pressed, his youthful innocence shining through. James laughed, the question catching him off guard. "I'm not sure if I'm important, but I think you're the most important person here." Theo's lips curved into a small smile, and for the first time, his guard seemed to lower. The conversation, though brief, left a profound impact on James. He couldn't quite articulate what he felt. Perhaps it was longing, regret, or the blossoming of a love he had yet to fully understand. As they left the cafe, Theo tugged at Elena's sleeve, speaking softly. "Mom, Mr. James is different. What do you think of him?" Elena asked gently, her tone carefully neutral. Theo shrugged, his young face thoughtful. "I'm not sure, but I think I want to see him again." Elena glanced back at James, who stood outside the cafe, his eyes following them with quiet intensity. She nodded subtly at him, a silent acknowledgement that this moment might be the beginning of something new. Inside the cafe, the warmth of the space mingled with the soft laughter and murmurs from nearby tables, creating an intimate, welcoming atmosphere. James, Elena, and Theo sat at a small wooden table by the window, where the afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting gentle golden streaks across the surface of the table. James, still nervous after the initial awkward moments, tried to spark a conversation with Theo. "So, you like playing the piano?" James asked, his deep voice steady but tinged with a hint of unease as he tried to mask his apprehension. Theo set down the small spoon he had been stirring in his cup of hot chocolate, his eyes showing a mix of curiosity and hesitation under James' attention. "Yes, I really like it," he answered carefully. "I tried learning piano when I was young," James said with a small smile. "But I wasn't very good at it." "Do you play often?" Theo studied him with a skeptical look, as if doubting the idea that this tall, serious man had ever done anything outside of work. After a pause, he replied, "I play a little every night. One time I performed at school, and Mom said I did very well." James nodded, his expression softening at the thought of Theo seated at a piano. "Do you have a favorite piece?" Theo thought for a moment, then said, "I like Clair de Lune by Debussy. It sounds really peaceful." James was surprised by the answer. "I like that piece too. It's a beautiful one. Did your mom introduce it to you?" Theo nodded, a faint smile appearing on his face. "Mom said Grandma loved that piece, so she wanted me to learn it." James glanced at Elena, their eyes meeting for a brief, silent moment. He felt an unspoken connection between the three of them, a bond he hadn't experienced before. James shifted the conversation, eager to learn more about Theo. "Besides piano, what else do you enjoy doing?" Theo leaned back in his chair, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "I like drawing too. I draw a lot of superheroes. Mom says I can draw whatever makes me happy." James chuckled, feeling his heart soften at Theo's innocence. "If you could draw something for me, what would you draw?" Theo thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe a man in a suit, because you're wearing one, but I'd give you a cowboy hat to make it more fun." James laughed, a genuine, light-hearted sound that even surprised him. "A cowboy hat, huh? That does sound fun. I think I'd like that." Theo grinned at his response, and for the first time, the tension between them began to melt away. As the conversation continued, James found himself noticing things about Theo that felt eerily familiar. The way Theo tilted his head when he was deep in thought, the sparkle in his eyes when he spoke about something he loved, it all reminded James of himself as a child. But it wasn't just the physical resemblances or mannerisms. Theo's way of thinking surprised him even more. When James asked about how he chose colors for his drawings, Theo replied with surprising logic. "I pick colors that match how I want it to feel. If I'm drawing a superhero flying, I use blue because it looks light. But if it's a superhero fighting, I use red because it's strong." James listened intently, feeling both proud and amazed. Theo wasn't just intelligent. He had a unique way of blending logic with creativity, a rare combination that struck a chord deep within James. By the end of the meeting, Theo was no longer as reserved as he had been. The boy began asking James questions about his work, the places he'd traveled, and what he enjoyed doing as a kid. James answered each question patiently, feeling like he was stepping into an entirely new world, one shaped by the curiosity and wonder of a child he was just beginning to know. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Theo looked up at James and asked, "Mr. James, would you like to hear me play the piano? I could play Clair de Lune for you." James froze for a moment, emotion swelling in his chest. "I would love that, Theo," he replied, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. A week after their first meeting, James received a message from Elena. "If you're interested, Theo's school is hosting a small recital this Saturday. Theo will be playing piano. If you're available, you're welcome to come." Her message was brief, but James understood that this wasn't just an ordinary invitation. It was a chance, a step closer to building a connection with his son. He replied immediately, "I'll be there." On Saturday afternoon, Theo's elementary school buzzed with laughter and chatter from parents and students. A small stage had been set up in the center of the auditorium, adorned with simple yet warm decorations and softly glowing lights. James entered the room, still dressed impeccably in his tailored suit, though this time paired with a more casual shirt in an effort to blend in with the friendly, laid-back atmosphere. He chose a seat in the back row, where he could observe without drawing attention to himself. After a series of charming performances by the students, singing, dancing, and skits, the announcer stepped up to the microphone. "Next, we'll enjoy a piano performance by Theo Parker, playing Debussy's Clair de Lune." James immediately sat up straighter, his eyes fixed on the side of the stage. Theo stepped out, dressed neatly in a white button-down shirt. His small frame, carried an unexpected air of confidence. The boy bowed to the audience before taking his seat at the glossy black piano. His tiny hands hovered momentarily over the keys, then descended with a delicate touch. The first notes of Clair de Lune filled the air, soft and mesmerizing, casting a hush over the room. The melody wove its way through the quiet auditorium, tender and full of emotion. James couldn't take his eyes off Theo, as if time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of the piece. The music carried James back to moments he had long buried. He remembered evenings in their sprawling mansion, when Elena would sit at the piano in the living room, her fingers gliding effortlessly over the keys. Elena had loved music so deeply she could lose herself for hours in her favorite pieces. Once, she played Clair de Lune for James, her eyes glowing with passion and tenderness. "Music is like a dream, James," she had said, her fingers trailing softly across the keys. "It speaks in ways words never can." At the time, James had only smiled, thinking music was part of Elena's world, a world he didn't quite belong to. But now, as he watched Theo perform the same piece with unwavering focus and devotion, James realized Elena's love for music had been passed down to their son. James felt his throat tighten. This wasn't just a boy playing the piano. It was a living connection to Elena, expressed through every note. Theo wasn't just a part of James, intelligent, logical, with those same steely gray eyes, but he also carried Elena's heart, her depth of feeling, and her extraordinary gift. When the final notes of Clair de Lune faded into the air, Theo lifted his head and bowed to the audience. Applause erupted throughout the room, but for James, everything else faded away except the boy at the piano. After the recital, James waited outside the auditorium. When Theo emerged, clutching a small bouquet of flowers his teacher had given him, their eyes met. James smiled as he stepped forward. "You were incredible, Theo," he said, his voice brimming with sincerity. Theo smiled shyly, a mixture of pride and caution on his young face. "Thank you, sir." Elena approached them shortly after, her expression soft as she glanced at James. "Thank you for coming," she said gently. James nodded, not trusting himself to say more. But deep down, he knew this was one of the most significant moments of his life. James left the school auditorium with an entirely new feeling, a sense of hope. The image of Theo sitting at the piano, his small hands gliding across the keys with such grace, remained vivid in his mind. For the first time in his life, James felt that becoming a father wasn't an unattainable concept or a distant responsibility. Theo wasn't a duty he needed to fulfill. The boy was a part of him, an undeniable bond that was as real as it was profound. As he climbed into his car, James pulled out his phone and began jotting down notes. He listed everything he needed to do to start building a relationship with Theo, learn more about his son's interests, take piano lessons to better understand Theo's passion, set aside regular time to meet with Theo, even if only for small moments, prove to Elena that he wouldn't be a fleeting presence in their lives. James reread the list, feeling a renewed determination swell within him. He knew this wasn't just for Theo. It was also for himself, a chance to correct the mistakes of his past. Meanwhile, Elena walked home with Theo. The boy chattered nonstop about the recital, his face lighting up as he recounted every detail, especially the joy of seeing James in the audience. "Did you know he was coming, Mom?" Theo asked, his gray eyes wide with curiosity. Elena nodded, holding his hand a little tighter. "Yes, he told me. He really wanted to see you perform." Theo smiled, but didn't ask anything more. Elena watched him closely, her heart filled with conflicting emotions. She couldn't deny that James had genuinely changed. He no longer rushed or tried to control the situation. His patience with Theo, the quiet way he supported the boy without being overbearing. It was all so different from the man she once knew. But the scars of the past lingered. Elena knew she couldn't simply open her heart again, not just for her own sake, but for Theo's as well. That evening, after Theo had fallen asleep, Elena received a phone call from James. "Thank you for inviting me." His voice came through, warm and sincere. You don't need to thank me, Elena replied, her tone gentle but guarded. It was an opportunity for you to see him. I saw more than that, Elena, James said, his voice filled with emotion. I saw how extraordinary our son is, and I realized that being a father isn't something I can learn overnight. But I want to try. I want to get it right this time. Elena was silent for a moment. James, this isn't about trying for a few weeks or months. Theo needs a father who will always be there, who will love him no matter what. I know, James said without hesitation. And I'm ready. I just hope you'll give me the chance to prove it. Elena sighed, her gaze drifting to the window. She didn't respond immediately, but deep inside, a small flicker of hope had begun to grow. The next day, James set his plans into motion. He hired a piano tutor and began learning from scratch. Despite having no natural talent, he was determined to understand Theo's passion. Each session, each note played, brought him closer to his goal. James also started researching parenting, devouring books on child psychology, including titles Elena had once mentioned during their marriage. Every small action, every deliberate choice, was driven by his desire to become a genuine part of Theo's life. Elena, on the other hand, continued to observe James from afar. She noticed the changes in his approach. Gone was the urgency, the need for control. Instead, he exhibited patience, humility, and sincerity. One evening, as Elena prepared dinner, Theo suddenly asked, "Mom, can I see Uncle James again? I want to play the piano for him." Elena paused, turning to look at her son. "You like Uncle James?" Theo nodded enthusiastically. "He's really nice, and he smiles a lot. I think he really likes listening to me play." Elena offered a faint smile, her heart beginning to waver. Maybe, just maybe, James truly had changed. But she knew only time would reveal if his transformation was real. James had never imagined he could prioritize anything over work, at least not until he learned about Theo's existence. But now, everything had changed. For the first time in his life, he realized that success meant nothing if he didn't have the chance to be the father Theo deserved. Sitting in his office on the top floor of Hartley Tower, James held his phone, staring at his packed schedule. Meetings, deals, and high-profile events had once been the cornerstone of his life, but now they no longer held the same significance. James decided to act. He called a meeting with his leadership team, where he made an announcement that surprised everyone. "Stephen," James addressed his most trusted associate, "you'll be taking on a larger role in the company. I trust you, and I need some time to focus on personal matters." Stephen blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but quickly nodded. "I'll handle everything, James. Don't worry." It was the first step. James began delegating more responsibilities to his management team, cutting back on the grueling hours he had once considered essential and dedicating more time to learning about Theo's life. James didn't stop at scaling back work. He started showing up at events in Theo's world. One afternoon, James attended Parent-Child Day at Theo's school, an event where parents participated in crafts and games with their children. While James felt out of place among casually dressed parents and noisy children, he kept a smile on his face. As James entered Theo's classroom, the boy froze for a moment when he saw him. "Uncle James, you're here too?" Theo asked, his tone a mix of surprise and delight. "I'm not just here," James said, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm ready to lose to you at clay sculpting." Theo laughed, and James felt a small wave of relief. They sat down at a tiny table together and began molding clay shapes under the teacher's instructions. Although James's attempts were far from perfect, his efforts to make goofy, misshapen figures had Theo giggling nonstop. James also offered to help Elena with Theo's school drop-offs a few times a week. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" Elena asked, her voice tinged with hesitation as James proposed the idea. James nodded firmly. "I want to try, Elena. This is what a father should do." On the first morning he took Theo to school, James felt more nervous than he had during multi-million-dollar negotiations. He even prepared breakfast for Theo, a simple sandwich he'd assembled with care. "Did you actually make this yourself?" Theo asked, eyeing the sandwich suspiciously. "I did," James replied, chuckling. "But if it's terrible, I'll take you out for breakfast instead." Theo took a bite and smiled. It's not bad. That simple remark felt like the highest compliment James had ever received. Over the weeks, James noticed subtle changes in Theo. The boy no longer kept a cautious distance and had grown more comfortable around him. One afternoon, as they played chess at Elena's house, Theo looked up and asked, "Uncle James, have you ever played chess with anyone else?" "I have," James answered with a smile. "But I've never lost to anyone until I played with you." "Really?" Theo's eyes lit up with excitement. "Really?" James nodded. "You're incredibly smart, Theo. I'm so proud of you." James's words made Theo's cheeks flush slightly, though the boy quickly hid his reaction by focusing on the chessboard. James knew that building a lasting relationship with Theo would take time and effort. But small moments like these gave him hope that he was on the right path. For the first time in his life, James found joy not in achievements or accolades, but in the little things: a shared laugh, a proud smile, or a quiet game of chess. And with each passing day, he felt more certain that he was becoming the father Theo deserved. On Monday morning, sunlight streamed gently through the kitchen window of Elena's home. She was preparing breakfast for Theo, her hands deftly arranging slices of bread on a plate, but her mind lingered on a recent conversation with James. "I want to help more," James had said, his voice warm yet earnest. "Not just picking Theo up from school, but with everything you need. You shouldn't have to do it all alone." Those words echoed in Elena's thoughts. For 7 years, she had grown accustomed to handling everything on her own. While she couldn't deny that James's support would ease her burden, a question lingered. Had he truly changed, or was this just a fleeting impulse? James started small. He consistently picked Theo up after school, sometimes bringing along a snack he had made himself. One late afternoon, as James arrived at the school, he noticed Elena struggling to load groceries into the trunk of her car. "Let me help," James offered, stepping forward before she could refuse. Elena hesitated briefly, but eventually stepped aside, allowing James to organize the bags neatly in the car. "Thank you," she said softly, her tone polite but guarded. "It's nothing," James replied with a faint smile. "It's the least I can do." Gradually, James's presence in Elena and Theo's daily life became more natural. He didn't just assist with school runs. He actively volunteered to participate in small family activities. One Sunday afternoon, James suggested that the three of them go to the park together. Although Elena hesitated at first, she finally agreed when she saw the excitement in Theo's eyes. They spent the afternoon under a clear blue sky. James and Theo kicked a soccer ball around on the grassy field while Elena sat nearby, watching with a soft smile. "Uncle James, I won!" Theo cheered, running toward Elena with a beaming grin. James followed, breathless but visibly happy. "He's really good, Elena. He's got a natural talent for sports." Elena glanced at James, and a familiar feeling washed over her unexpectedly. This was the kind of scene she had once dreamed of, a simple family moment filled with laughter and connection. Though James's actions were becoming increasingly genuine, Elena remained cautious. The wounds from their past, when James had placed his work above everything else, had not fully healed. But over time, she began to notice subtle differences in him. One evening, when James dropped Theo off after a basketball practice, Elena saw him kneel to tie Theo's shoelaces. His expression was so tender, as if nothing in the world mattered more than his son at that moment. Elena couldn't help but smile. While she wasn't ready to trust entirely, she couldn't deny that James was trying, with all his heart, to make amends. Late one evening, after Theo had gone to bed, Elena was tidying up the kitchen when James walked in, holding a dish towel. Without a word, he started drying the dishes she had just washed. Elena looked at him in surprise. "You don't have to do that." James smiled but didn't stop. "I want to. I don't want you to carry everything alone anymore." Elena fell silent, a strange, unexpected emotion stirring within her. This was James, the man who had once hurt her deeply, now standing before her, patient and thoughtful in a way that left her momentarily unguarded. Little by little, moments like these began to accumulate, slowly mending the cracks in Elena's heart. On another quiet evening, the three of them sat in the living room. Theo was deeply engrossed in assembling a puzzle on the floor, and James knelt beside him, helping him find the right pieces. Elena sat nearby on the sofa, a cup of tea in her hands. The atmosphere was warm and tranquil, a feeling Elena hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. She observed James silently, noting the care and gentleness in his demeanor. Elena didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: James had changed. And that change made her feel just a little safer, a little more willing to let him be a part of her and Theo's lives again. James stood in the middle of the store, his eyes landing on a wicker picnic basket displayed on the shelf. It was the final item on the list he had carefully planned for his picnic outing with Theo and Elena. Reaching for the basket, James found himself smiling. He once thought organizing something like this was trivial, hardly worth his time. But now he understood that it was the small, simple moments that brought a family closer together. That morning, gentle sunlight bathed the rolling green hills of a park not far from Willow Creek. James parked the car near a large expanse of grass, the spot he had chosen for their picnic. Elena stepped out first, followed closely by Theo, who bounded toward the field, clutching the soccer ball James had bought him. "Uncle James, are we going to play soccer?" Theo called out, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Absolutely," James replied with a grin. He turned to Elena. "Should we start with the food, or wait until Theo and I burn off some energy?" Elena raised an eyebrow, smiling. "I think you two should play first. I'll set everything up here." James and Theo began kicking the ball around on the open field. Theo's laughter filled the air as James intentionally lost during a playful tackle. "Uncle James, you're not very good at soccer," Theo teased, his eyes gleaming with mischief. James laughed loudly, pretending to collapse onto the grass as Theo scored a goal. "All right, you win. I think you should go pro." "Really?" Theo asked, his voice brimming with excitement. "Really?" James nodded, completely serious. "I've never seen anyone play as well as you at your age." Theo beamed. Running over to Elena to recount his victory, James stood, watching the small figure of his son sprinting toward his mother, and felt a deep swell of pride and happiness. When the ball had rolled enough, the three of them gathered around the picnic blanket James had laid out. Elena unpacked the basket, revealing an assortment of snacks they all shared. James watched Elena as she carefully set out the food, her hands moving with practiced ease. He couldn't help but recall the dinners she used to prepare for them when they were together, a wave of bittersweet nostalgia washing over him. But this time, he didn't let those memories overshadow the present. "This sandwich is delicious, Mom," Theo said, his mouth half full as he complimented her. "Mom's a great cook," James added, his tone sincere as he looked at Elena. Elena hesitated briefly, then smiled. "Thanks, but I don't think I'm that good." "You're better than you think," James replied, his voice soft but genuine. After lunch, they played small games together, from passing the ball to searching for hidden objects in the grass. While these activities were new to James, he found himself completely immersed, discovering a joy he hadn't known existed. As the sun began to set, they sat together on a wooden bench, watching the golden light disappear behind the hills. Theo nestled between them, resting his head on Elena's shoulder while his small hand clasped James's. "What did you think of today, Theo?" James asked softly. Theo tilted his head up, his eyes glowing. "It was amazing, Uncle James. I want to do this more often." James smiled, glancing at Elena over Theo's head. "We'll make this a regular thing," he said, not just to Theo, but as a quiet promise to Elena. Elena didn't respond, but in her eyes, James saw a glimmer of warmth he hadn't seen in years. The picnic wasn't just a fun outing. It was a turning point in the relationship between James, Theo, and Elena. Theo felt the genuine warmth of having both his parents present, not as isolated moments, but as a real connection. He saw that James wasn't there out of obligation, but because he truly wanted to be a part of their lives. For Elena, the change in James was becoming undeniable. He was no longer the distant man she once knew. He was patient, sincere, and willing to do whatever it took to mend the bonds he had once broken. The golden sunset stretched across the sky, painting the clouds in warm hues of orange and amber. The three of them sat on an old wooden bench in the park, where the chirping of birds blended seamlessly with the soft, cooling breeze. Elena quietly took in the view, her mind swirling with thoughts she found hard to put into words. James sat beside her, with Theo nestled between them, his head resting on his mother's shoulder, his small hand still clutching James's as if it were an invisible thread binding them all together. As the sun sank lower on the horizon, Elena couldn't help but reflect on the days gone by. She thought of the pain, the disappointment she had endured during her marriage to James, the countless times she felt like an outsider in his life. But now, the man sitting next to her was no longer the James she had known before. From the corner of her eye, Elena observed him. The way he gently adjusted Theo's coat as the boy dozed off, the way he patiently listened and engaged in conversation with their son, and the way his eyes radiated pure love every time he looked at the boy. This wasn't a fleeting change meant to impress or atone for past mistakes. It was real. It was a transformation rooted in patience, sincerity, and an acute awareness of the damage he had caused. Elena realized that, though the scars in her heart hadn't completely healed, James was doing everything he could to mend them, not with words but with actions. Meanwhile, James quietly watched Elena. He noticed the softness in her gaze, and for the first time in years, he felt the distance between them begin to close. He understood now that what mattered most wasn't grand promises or elaborate plans. For Theo and Elena, what they needed from him was his true presence, moment by moment, day by day, and through every small but meaningful choice. James thought back to the days when he buried himself in work, convinced that wealth and power would bring happiness. But now, as he looked at Theo's smile and the gentle light in Elena's eyes, he knew that happiness wasn't in far-off achievements, but in the simplest, closest things. Theo stirred slightly in his sleep, his tiny hand clutching James's coat. Elena leaned down, tenderly brushing her son's hair away from his face. She looked up, meeting James's eyes in a moment of quiet understanding. "Thank you," Elena whispered, her voice soft but heartfelt. James blinked in surprise, then offered her a small, genuine smile. "I'm only doing what I should have done a long time ago, Elena." Elena didn't reply, but in her heart, a spark of hope began to grow. James stood in the small garden on the outskirts of Willow Creek, his eyes scanning every detail around him. This was the place he had chosen for the most important evening of his life. A night that could change everything between him and Elena. James stood in the small garden on the outskirts of Willow Creek, his eyes scanning every detail around him. This was the place he had chosen for the most important evening of his life. A night that could change everything between him and Elena. The garden was a modest yet charming space, surrounded by lush hydrangea bushes that Elena had always adored. James had picked this spot not for its grandeur or opulence, but because it held the memories of her childhood dreams, which she had once shared with him here. James had spent days planning this evening. He hadn't hired professional event organizers or arranged for extravagant decorations as he might have done in the past. Instead, he had taken care of every detail himself, from the decor to the music that would play softly in the background. He bought delicate paper lanterns, stringing them from the branches of the surrounding trees. Their gentle glow cast a romantic, understated light over the garden. At the center, he set up a small wooden table draped in a pristine white cloth, flanked by two simple chairs adorned with soft fabric. A vase of fresh hydrangeas stood in the middle, adding a touch of natural elegance. For the meal, James chose simple yet meaningful fare. Instead of ordering from a five-star restaurant, he visited a beloved family diner in town, one of Elena's favorites. The menu included honey-glazed roasted chicken, a fresh garden salad, and a bottle of red wine he knew she loved. When everything was nearly ready, James stood in the middle of the garden, a wave of nervous anticipation washing over him. He looked around, wondering if what he had done would be enough for Elena to see how much he had changed. James had hosted countless grand events, entertaining hundreds of important figures, but this felt entirely different. Here, he had no control over the outcome, and the uncertainty made his heart race. Will she come? James whispered to himself, his hands gripping the edge of the tablecloth. And if she does, will she believe I've truly changed? He knew Elena wasn't someone who opened her heart easily. The years of hurt she'd endured couldn't be erased by a single evening. But James also knew that if he didn't try, he would never have the chance to prove his love and sincerity. That afternoon, James sent her a simple message. Elena, there's something important I need to tell you. If you're able, please come to the garden you love at 7 p.m. I'll be waiting. He didn't elaborate, didn't press. He wanted her to have the freedom to decide. At precisely 7 p.m., everything was ready. James stood by the table, his eyes fixed on the garden's gate. The glow from the lanterns reflected off the table, casting a warm, inviting light over the setting. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. James couldn't stop his mind from imagining the worst. Maybe she won't come, he thought, a pang of disappointment and fear tightening his chest. Yet he remained rooted to the spot, unwilling to leave. He knew this was his one chance to lay his heart bare. Then, at 7:20, the small wooden gate creaked open. Elena stepped in, her slender figure illuminated by the soft light of the lanterns. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, her hair cascading gently over her shoulders. Her eyes widened slightly with surprise as she took in the scene before her. James moved toward her, his heartbeat quickening with every step. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Elena offered a faint smile, her gaze sweeping over the garden. "You prepared all of this yourself?" "I did," James replied, his eyes locked on hers. "I wanted it to be special because I need you to hear what I have to say." Elena didn't respond immediately. She stepped closer to the table, her hand resting on the vase of hydrangeas, as if to steady herself. "So, what is it you want to say, James?" she asked, her voice soft yet cautious. James took a deep breath, knowing the pivotal moment had arrived. Under the soft glow of the paper lanterns strung among the branches, the small garden felt warm and inviting. A gentle breeze stirred the hydrangeas, carrying their delicate fragrance through the tranquil evening air. Elena stepped into the space, her eyes falling on the carefully arranged table adorned with fresh flowers and flickering candles. Everything was simple, yet breathtakingly beautiful. "You did all of this for me?" Elena asked, her voice soft but laden with emotion. James nodded, his gaze meeting hers with a tenderness and sincerity she had never seen from him before. "Yes," he replied, stepping forward, keeping just enough distance so as not to overwhelm her. "Do you remember this place, Elena?" James began, his voice warm yet tinged with nervousness. "It was here that you told me about your dreams. A simple life where we could live for each other and our family, instead of chasing after unnecessary luxuries." Elena didn't respond, but her eyes remained fixed on him, listening to every word. James continued, his hands clenching slightly as though to steady his emotions. "I didn't understand then. I thought success, money, and grandeur could replace love and presence. I was wrong, Elena. The greatest mistake I ever made was letting you and Theo slip away from me." He took a deep breath, his eyes searching hers for even a flicker of forgiveness. "But over these past 7 years, I've learned that nothing matters more than family. You and Theo, you are the only meaning in my life. Without you, everything I've achieved feels hollow." James bowed his head slightly, as though laying down every ounce of pride to say what came next. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I'm asking you, begging you, Elena, please give me a chance to make things right this time. I want to be with you, with Theo, not out of obligation, but because I love you, because I want to rebuild the family we never should have lost." The garden seemed to hold its breath. James' words hung in the air, every syllable heavy with regret and raw, unguarded sincerity. Elena turned away, her hands gripping the vase of hydrangeas as if to anchor herself. She could feel the change in James' voice, in his eyes, but the pain of the past was not so easily dismissed. "James, I can't deny that you've changed," she said, her voice low but steady. "I see the effort you're making, and I know you love Theo. But do you understand that trust isn't something that comes back with a few promises or a romantic evening? James nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting sadness but not defeat. I understand, he said, his voice soft yet resolute. And I'm willing to wait. I know I hurt you, and I don't expect you to forget that. But I'll keep proving myself, not with words, but with actions day by day. I want you to see that I'm here, Elena, and I'm not going anywhere, no matter what. Elena felt her guard faltering. His words no longer carried the arrogance or entitlement they once had. Instead, they were the humble confession of a man who had finally realized the true value of love and family. She turned back to face him, her gaze softer now. James, I want to believe you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But you have to understand this isn't just about me. It's about Theo. I can't let our son go through more pain. James took a step closer, his eyes unwavering. I know, and because of Theo, I cannot afford to fail. I will never hurt our son, Elena. I swear it. Elena stood still in the garden, the soft glow of lanterns casting a golden light over her hair, creating a scene so ethereal that James couldn't look away. Yet, her heart was a storm of emotions, difficult to name or control. James' heartfelt confession echoed in her mind, earnest and sincere, but alongside it came the painful memories of the years they had spent apart. Once, she had loved James with everything she had, only to feel utterly alone within the very marriage she had cherished. Standing there, Elena couldn't help but reflect on James' journey of transformation over the past few months. She remembered the first time he appeared in Willow Creek, his awkwardness and apprehension as he tried to connect with Theo. She couldn't forget the look of awe and raw emotion in his eyes as he watched Theo play the piano, as if he was beginning to understand all that he had missed. She remembered how he had patiently taken the time to get to know their son, slowly but surely building not just a relationship with Theo, but also a fragile bridge back to her. James was no longer the man who offered hollow promises and empty gestures. Instead, he had shown his love through actions, small, thoughtful, and deeply meaningful. She recalled the day James and Theo played soccer in the park, with James feigning defeat just to see the boys' uncontrollable laughter. Or the quiet evening when the three of them sat together in the living room, piecing together a puzzle as laughter filled the room, bringing a sense of peace she hadn't thought she could feel again. All of it had painted a picture of a different James, a man who could love, who could listen, and who was determined to right the wrongs of his past. James stood a few feet away, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Elena could see the tension in his expression, but he didn't press her for an answer. He was giving her space, and that alone made her believe that his change was genuine. She exhaled deeply, her gaze shifting to the starry sky above. James, she began softly, her voice barely louder than the breeze. You've changed. I can't deny that. James remained silent, his heart pounding as he waited for her to continue. I see your effort, Elena said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. The way you put Theo first, the way you've respected my boundaries. That's something I never saw in you before. She turned to face him, her eyes gentle but tinged with caution. I can't promise that this will be easy, James, but I'm willing to give you another chance. James stood frozen for a moment, almost unable to believe the words he had just heard. Elena, are you sure? He asked, his voice low, as if afraid to break the spell. Yes, Elena replied, her gaze unwavering. Not because of the promises you've made, but because of the actions you've taken. You've shown me that you truly want to be a good father, and someone I can trust. A surge of happiness and relief washed over James, overwhelming in its intensity. He took a step closer to Elena, but didn't dare embrace her, instead holding his ground with gratitude etched across his face. Thank you, Elena, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Thank you for giving me the chance to make things right. Elena nodded slightly, her lips curving into a small smile. We'll work on this together, James. Not just for me, or for you, but for Theo. He deserves to have a whole family. I won't let you down, James replied, his voice steady, full of conviction. The golden glow of the sunrise filtered through the leafy canopy, casting warm light across the modest wooden house at the edge of a peaceful town. Its wide porch and garden brimming with hydrangeas, the flowers Elena adored, added a touch of timeless charm. This was no luxurious mansion filled with modern amenities, but for James, Elena, and Theo, it was more than enough. It was a sanctuary where they could begin anew, a life full of peace and warmth. On their first morning in the house, the family gathered around the small kitchen table. Elena brewed a pot of tea, while James helped Theo set the table with delicate stacks of pancakes. "Dad, more honey?" Theo exclaimed, his bright eyes brimming with excitement as James brought over the honey jar. James chuckled, carefully drizzling the honey in a spiral pattern on Theo's pancakes. "Perfect, right?" he asked with a grin. "Perfect," Theo replied, raising a tiny thumb in approval before taking a big bite. From her seat, Elena watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling with joy. The man standing before her, once consumed by work and the trappings of a wealthy lifestyle, was now fully present, cherishing the simplest moments with their son. That afternoon, the family spent time in the garden, each finding their place in its quiet rhythm. Elena taught Theo how to plant flowers, guiding his small hands to tuck seeds gently into the soil. Nearby, James worked on repairing an old swing under a shady tree. "Dad, are you sure it won't break when I sit on it?" Theo asked, his expression serious, but his eyes twinkling with curiosity. Wiping the sweat from his brow, James gave an assuring smile. "Absolutely. I tested it with my own weight before finishing the repairs." When the swing was ready, Theo eagerly climbed aboard, laughing as it swayed back and forth. Watching from a distance, Elena smiled at James. The caution and skepticism that had once lingered in her gaze were replaced with warmth and trust. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, the three of them sat on the porch together. Theo nestled between his parents, his head resting against Elena's shoulder, a book in hand that James had thoughtfully chosen for him from the town's bookshop. "I love this house, Mom," Theo murmured, his voice soft but brimming with contentment. Elena leaned down, planting a gentle kiss on his hair. "I do too, Theo." James watched them, his heart swelling with gratitude for this newfound harmony. He turned to Elena, his voice low but filled with emotion. "Thank you, Elena, for giving me this chance to make things right, and for trusting me again." Elena's lips curved into a gentle smile as she met his gaze. "And thank you, James, for showing me that change is possible and that family is what truly matters." A lesson in love. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, the family sat quietly, savoring the simplicity of the moment. There was no grandeur, no extravagant displays, just the understated beauty of togetherness, a feeling that had eluded them for so long. Love, they realized, was not about grandeur or material wealth. It was about presence, understanding, and shared moments that spoke louder than words. They knew challenges would come, but with the love and connection they had rediscovered, they were ready to face them together. This story of James, Elena, and Theo serves as a poignant reminder that love and family thrive not on material riches or empty promises, but on genuine presence and thoughtful actions. In today's fast-paced world, it's essential to cherish the ones we hold dear, listening with our hearts, sharing the small, meaningful moments, and prioritizing relationships over fleeting distractions. Happiness, after all, is found in the bonds we nurture with those we love. Do you think James can overcome his past and rebuild a life of happiness? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to follow our channel to stay updated with more heartfelt stories like this one.